Hey everyone! Welcome back to Mr. Rowan's Art Studio. Today, I was feeling inspired by all the beautiful wildflowers that have been appearing in my yard. Some people may think that they're just weeds, but to me, flowers like dandelions are a sign that spring has arrived. And these are flowers you can probably find around your home as well, as they grow just about everywhere. Maybe you've seen some of them already. I decided to collect a few and make a watercolor painting of them. If you'd like, you can paint along with me, or you can make your own paintings of things you found outside of your own home. If you don't have watercolors at home, that's fine. You can use whatever art supplies you have, or you can just watch and hopefully get inspired to make your own art. Either way, I hope I can teach you a few tips and tricks for using watercolors. Let's get started. I like to start out my watercolor paintings by using washi tape or painter's tape to tape my artwork to my work surface, which in this case is my art desk. This not only helps keep my paper from moving while I paint, but it stops the paper from curling or buckling while I paint. Even nice watercolor paper, like the kind I'm using, can curl or deform when it gets wet. Then, you need to wake up your watercolors by getting them wet. You can't paint with dry watercolors. That's why they're called watercolors. They need water in order to work. So using a clean brush, dab some clean water over your paints, then wait a few minutes to give the paint time to absorb the water. If you've ever been frustrated that your watercolors are too light or streaky, it's probably because your paints weren't wet enough, or you hadn't given them enough time to absorb the water and wake up all the way. While you're waiting for your paint to wake up, make sure you have 2 cups of water. The first is for rinsing your brush when it has paint on it. This is our dirty water. The second is where we dip our rinsed brush to load it up with clean water before adding more water to our paints or paper. This keeps our paints from getting muddy. Also, grab something you can use to dry your brush off with. I'm using an art sponge, but you can use paper towels, dish towels, anything absorbent to dry your brush off with. Now that we have everything we need, let's get started. I'm going to start by painting these dandelions. When you're painting with watercolors, you want to paint from light to dark. That means we start off with the lightest colors and add the darker colors slowly as we go along. This is because we use the white of the paper instead of white paint. So if you want a space to be light, like the white dandelion puffball, we want to be very careful not to add too much paint to the space where it'll be. So since the puffball is soft and fluffy looking, I got my paper wet with clean water first, before adding just a tiny bit of green and brown paint. And that gives it this blurry, kind of soft look. So this is what we call the wet and wet technique, because we get the paper wet first, and then we add wet paint to it. And that's what gives it that soft, blurry, dreamy effect. This puffball is kind of hard to see at first, but once I paint everything around it, you'll be able to see it much better, I promise. See, now I'll paint the yellow dandelion flowers. And I want to be able to see their individual little petals, so I'm adding my wet paint to a dry part of the paper. So this is called the wet on dry technique. This is going to give us much sharper details. These flowers have bright yellow petals around their outside, but darker, more golden yellow petals at their centers. So I'll start by painting the lightest yellow petals first. Then, while I wait for that layer to dry, we can paint some leaves. Try not to worry too much about being super realistic. Watercolor is a great medium for relaxing and making messy, dreamy looking paintings. Don't feel like you have to paint every detail. I'm starting off with just some green squiggly shapes that I think kind of look like leaves, and that's okay. I'm starting off with a very light green. I don't think that's the color these leaves will stay, but this is just my first layer. It's like a sketch when you're drawing. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. We're just trying to get our ideas down. So let's add some green stems. Looking at my flowers, I see that their stems have a little bit of a reddish tone, so let's add some red too. We never think of flower stems as anything but green, don't we? That's why sometimes it's nice to paint while looking at the real thing, because that way we can be reminded of all the cool little details that we otherwise might not see or remember. See how I'm making sure to save space for my white dandelion puff? So now we can slowly start building up the darker colors. Let's make these leaves a little darker, shall we? Maybe with a cooler green color. You can even add some of the red color we used earlier to add details to the leaves. Putting darker leaves beneath the lighter leaves gives the illusion of depth and makes our painting look more three-dimensional. And it helps the flowers stand out more. We don't want them to disappear into the background, do we? I mentioned earlier that I was using watercolor paper. If you're painting with watercolor, it's important to use the right kind of paper. Normal drawing paper will rip or fall apart when it gets wet. So you definitely don't want to use normal printer paper with watercolors. But watercolor paper is specially made so that it can get wet without tearing or disintegrating. There are different types of watercolor paper. Some are more expensive than others. If you don't have watercolor paper, you can paint on cardstock, which is the paper that most greeting cards or invitations are printed on. Ask your parents, they might have some lying around. Let's see, now that the first layer of yellow paint is dry for our flowers, let's add some more details. Make sure you clean your brush very well before you switch colors, especially if you're switching to yellow. It's really easy to mess up your yellow paint with a dirty brush. So let's rinse all of the paint off in the dirty water, then dip your brush in your clean water before touching your yellow paint. Okay, let's add some darker, sort of gold petals closer to the center of our flowers. See how crisp the new petals look? It's because we waited for the layer of paint underneath to be dry. Waiting is sometimes the hardest part of painting with watercolors. I get very impatient sometimes. I know some artists even use hair dryers to make their paint dry faster. I personally don't do this, but you can if you want. Experiment, have fun. So let's also add some details to the dandelion puff. Again, now that it's dry, the paint right here looks very crisp instead of blurry. So if I want to add more blurry color, I'll have to get my paper wet again. Make sure you use your clean water if you re-wet your paper. See, look how nice and blurry that looks. That's exactly what I wanted. Sometimes when I paint with watercolor, it feels less like painting and more like discovering a painting. Sometimes the watercolors don't always do exactly what I expect them to do, but instead of getting upset or stressed out, I just try to see what the paint wants to do, and I adapt. This painting doesn't have to look exactly like the flowers I picked. If I wanted an exact copy of these dandelions, I could have just taken a picture. So it's okay if some of these leaves aren't the same shape or the colors aren't perfectly realistic. Just relax and see what sort of painting you create. It'll be beautiful no matter what. I try to strike a balance between adding realistic details and making these sort of abstract suggestions of what I'm painting. Whether you paint realistic or abstract, both are valid ways to make art. So let's add some more details to our leaves and our flowers. And there we go, dandelions. I'm really proud of this painting. and I'm so happy you guys joined me today. This painting looks really nice, but I don't think it's done yet, so I'm going to keep going and paint even more flowers. So stay tuned to our Facebook page and see my finished painting, which I will post tomorrow. Let me know in the comments if you liked this video and if you want me to make more videos like this one. Stay well, everyone. Thanks for painting with me. Bye.